there's going to be tensions. It's just inevitable. Let's not try to fight them. Let's accept them and figure out how to work with them.
Welcome back to 40-Minute Mentor, your pocket-sized career mentor on a mission to raise aspirations and inspire the next generation of category-defining founders. From purpose-led entrepreneurs to world-class investors and even Olympic champions, you'll learn firsthand from today's successful leaders on what it takes to be brilliant, all in just 40 minutes. Today, we're kicking off a brand new feature, a specialist advice series. Over the coming 5 weeks, we'll be joined by subject matter experts that are going to help us take a deep dive into often requested topics, including communication, fractional working, feedback cultures, and much more. In today's episode, we'll be taking a deep dive into conflict management. And to help us do that, we're joined by workplace expert and longtime Harvard Business Review reporter and editor, Amy Gallo. You may have come across Amy on other podcasts, including her co-hosted HBR podcast, Women at Work, or perhaps you've read one of her best-selling books, including Getting Along, How to Work with Anyone, even difficult people, as well as hundreds of articles she's written for the Harvard Business Review. Amy and I were connected by mutual friend and podcast legend Helen Tupper from Squiggly Careers, who has also previously come on 40-Minute Mentor. Helen is amazing and raved about Amy, so I can't wait to dig into all of her important advice on effective communication and conflict management in today's episode.
Amy, a big welcome to 40-Minute Mentor. Thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you, James?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm really excited for this conversation. So thank you so much for being here. We always like to start the podcast with a few quick sort of kickoff questions. So I wondered if you didn't mind finishing the following sentences after me. Number 1, I feel most energized when...
When I'm connected to other people. And actually, I will even add a slightly narrower view on that, which is that when I have a disagreement or a conflict with someone, and then I'm actually able to get through it, and then we reconnect and sort of reset our relationship. That for me is an exciting moment.
Love that. Love that. And we will be talking more about this concept very soon. So thank you for the teaser. My biggest failure to date is...
Oh, this is a hard one because I fail every day. I fail to get through my to-do list. I fail to make someone feel included. I fail, so many things. So I think my life is sort of a series of small failures that I learn from rather than one big one. The big ones, like I regret sometimes not going to grad school for public health, which I had aimed to do when I was younger. I sort of regret going to work for this management consulting firm because I didn't love management consulting, but they've all led to where I am today. And so it's sort of hard to really regret them because I'm so happy with where my career has taken me and what I've been able to do.
Well, that's a great answer. And I think, often those things that you look back and you go, oh, I didn't enjoy that. Those often are the experiences that teach you the most, aren't they? So I think I can really resonate with that.
Absolutely.
Final quick fire question. Good mentorship means to me...
Understanding the other person, what they want to achieve, and then using your superpowers to help them achieve that.
Love it. Brilliant. And we were saying offline, I've benefited a lot from mentorships that have done exactly that for me. And it just is so impactful, isn't it? Well, I am super grateful that we get to benefit from your mentorship today. So before we dive into learning more about your career, I just wanted to go back to the beginning, if you don't mind, and talk a bit about your upbringing, the early life of Amy. What was that like? How has that sort of impacted the person and leader you are today?
Yeah, I mean, I think like many people, it had such a big impact. I was raised by a single mom. She raised me and my older brother. She actually, out of necessity, I don't know if she was planning to work or not, but because she got divorced when me and my brother were young, she started this career and actually was a lobbyist. So she worked with a state government in Connecticut to lobby on behalf of mostly nonprofits on social justice issues. And she was the first female lobbyist in the state and had just an incredibly illustrious career, so many wonderful successes around civil rights, women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights. And she was such a role model, both in terms of finding a career you love, but also doing something that was hard, but being okay with the challenge, right? And I think also there's another piece of it, which is she really taught my brother and I, you need to be independent. Ideally, you'll find someone to spend your life with, but no matter what you do, make sure you can be independent at the end of the day. And that's been a big factor in sort of how I've navigated my career. I think now she's very proud of me, of course. But I think if she had her druthers, I would have gone into nonprofit work. I would have followed her footsteps, maybe even taken over her business. But I think she's just thrilled that both my brother and I have found things that we love to do and are quite independent, which is lovely. So that was a big piece of it. I grew up in a state called Connecticut here in the US. I had lived in New York and San Francisco. I got to live overseas in Moscow, in Seoul for 4 months when I was working with a management consulting firm. So I was also involved in a lot of international experiences, which have also influenced how I think about work and relationships. But, I think that one of the other things that's really influenced what I've done is I've always been interested. And I think in part because of my early life, I've been always interested in how relationships form, what strains them, what happens when they fall apart, and how can we repair them. And that's really the focus of my career now, is really thinking about relationships at work. What makes them challenging? What makes them rewarding, right? How do we transform some of the challenging ones into the more rewarding ones?
Wow, what an important topic. And we're going to talk lots about it. So I'm really excited about that because it's something that I think everybody listening to this episode, myself included, can benefit a lot from your learnings and expertise. It sounds like your mother did a brilliant job because as a parent myself, I have an 8-year-old daughter. You have all these dreams and aspirations for your children. Of course, in many ways, I would love my daughter to play football for my club and achieve world domination. But the real truth is you want your child to follow their passions and to be happy. And the fact that you and you mentioned your siblings as well are that and have been very successful. That is the ultimate aim for a parent, isn't it? And that's something that's really cool. And not everyone has that. So that's great to hear.
Yeah. And I think she would say, it's funny, I think if she were here, and this is no shade toward her, but she would say she wasn't an ideal parent. Like she was really just surviving, right? Like single mom, full-time job, 2 kids. She was really just surviving, but it was partly, and this is always a good reminder to me because I have a 17-year-old daughter. And I've always tried to be very conscientious about what lessons we're teaching or what values we're imparting. I don't think my mom had any time to think about that. She just was a role model. And that worked out really well for us. And so I think that's one of the other things, is that how I live my life is actually far more important than how I parent, right? As a verb, right? Of course, I want to be thoughtful and careful about what I teach her, but she's going to learn so much more from watching me and my spouse than she is going to from what we say.
That's so true. And I think that independence you've been given and the self-sufficiency, I think, is a really important thing as you grow up, and to give that to your child as well, and to mine and anyone listening, I think is that's something really important. But we have so much to cover, so we could go down a rabbit hole this, but we'll carry on. I guess a lot of our listeners will probably know you from your work as a speaker or an author, but you've mentioned your early career in management consulting, which is topical because I started my career as a headhunter in the consulting industry.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that's where I started. And funnily enough, when a lot of the best talent in consulting, and it is a fantastic place a grounding to start a career. A lot of the best people I knew from consulting were moving towards tech, and that's how we ended up. We just followed them, and that's why we do what we do today. So I'm interested in that part of your career. Do you mind sharing, and particularly because I suspect there are going to be consultants that are listening to this that want to move into tech or want to become an author? I'm sure that those people are out there. So tell us a bit about that part of your career. Why did you choose on consulting when you did? And what impact did that part of your career have on you as where you are today?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny if I say, well, I sort of regret going into it, partly because I didn't love it, but it was the most formative part of my career and the biggest pivot to where I am now. So I actually left college and was doing nonprofit work. I was actually working for HIV prevention organizations, first in San Francisco and then in Moscow. And when I moved back to San Francisco, I had a job I loved. I was working for the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. It was great. But I realized, I was like, I'm never going to pay my student loans. Like, this is just not, and I'm not sure that self-sufficiency that my mom really encouraged. I was like, I'm not sure this is going to do it. And so I thought, I was actually moving to New York to be back closer to family. And I thought, let me try something that makes money. And I had all these friends in college who had gone to management consulting firms. I was like, that sounds interesting. So a friend of a friend had started a firm. It was sort of a spinoff of McKinsey. All the partners had been at McKinsey. It was really focusing on the intersection between organization and strategy. And you and your listeners are going to think I'm exaggerating, but when I went to interview for this job, I didn't even know what costs and revenue were. Like, I really didn't. I was so, my mom she ran her own business, but we didn't talk about it. My dad was a teacher. I just had no clue. And they took the biggest risk on hiring me. In fact, they told me after the interview process, and as the headhunter for consulting, how intensive those interview processes for consulting firms can be. So halfway through, I'd met like 10 people at that point, and they're like, we are so torn about you. Half of us think we would be crazy to hire you. Half of us think we should take the risk. And I was like, okay. So I went through like another 10 interviews, got the job, I was so thrilled. And I will say, I didn't love the work. I didn't love being a consultant. I didn't love there was a lot of when the client says jump, you say how high. I didn't feel like I was great in the client service department. I did learn a lot about how businesses run, but ultimately what I really learned, and this is what was the pivot, was that I was sitting in these meetings with executive teams of large organizations, pharmaceutical companies, other consulting firms. And I was realizing they're talking about strategy, they're talking about operations, but the success or failure really seems to be on how well these people interact, on their collaboration, on whether they can actually get along, whether they can have conflicts and move through them, whether they avoid conflict completely, right? And so I was very interested in, this is the glue, right? This is the glue. This is the fuel. This is how we actually make things happen, is through our interactions with other people. And you would be hard pressed to find someone these days whose job does not involve interacting with other people on a regular basis.
Yeah. Wow. So it was very formative.
It was. And I had a wonderful mentor there who was one of the partners of the firm, he was the one who said, I think he's the one who made the call on taking the risk on hiring me. And I got to work with him on a ton of projects. Incredibly brilliant guy. And I think he really fed that fascination. In fact, he and I collaborated with some of the other firm members on a project about the informal organization. So behind the formal org chart, how do things actually get done? How does power work? And so that was the beginning of my work on writing and thinking about interactions at work and relationships at work.
Well, that's so cool. That's really, really interesting. I got to ask, what do you think it was that made him take the leap of faith on you? Because that is, as you say, consulting interviews are notoriously very difficult, and they do all these case studies, and it's so intense. So that really is going against the norm. So what did you do? And this is a tip for anyone that's maybe trying to pivot careers at the moment, go to something that maybe their CV wouldn't suggest they'd be ideal for. Can you take yourself back to that moment? What stood out for them, do you think?
That is a really good question. And I should actually ask him again. I know I've asked him in the past. I'm like, why in the world did you hire me? I think I did two things. One, I do remember, they often use case questions. I don't know if consulting firms still use case questions in interview. He said you had one of the most interesting answers to a case question that he had ever heard. And I think partly that was because I didn't know much about how businesses run. So I was really drawing from my own experience of I was really trying to put myself in the shoes of the person we were talking about in the case. And I think I showed both ability to solve a problem on my feet, which I think is what case studies are about, but also a level of empathy of what would it be like to try to do that thing? And it was actually something about gift certificates, if I remember. I mean, this was a while ago now, but I was like, okay, if I was trying to sell, it was about hotels. That's what it was. It was something about hotels, and then I brought in gift certificates. I don't remember the exact answers, but I think it was more that I was demonstrating, again, both a combination of problem solving as well as sort of empathy and being able to put myself in the position of the person who was trying to solve this problem. I think the other thing is I pride myself, I do think it's one of my skills, is that being able to connect with people. And I think I really showed, even if I lacked the knowledge, I was curious enough, I was connected enough, engaged enough that I would learn really quickly. Now, I'll be honest, every performance review I got while I worked for that consulting firm mentioned that I did not have good business acumen, which is so funny now that I run my own business. But it was clear, like, this was a learning curve for me. And then while I brought a lot of interesting skills to consulting, business acumen was not one of them.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing that. I think that's really helpful for a lot of our listeners that might be, because I think sometimes you need to push yourself outside your comfort zone. It's really good for you. But also, I'd imagine your colleagues would have got a lot from your fresh perspectives. And as you say, you combine that IQ and EQ and that ability to connect with people, and that goes a long way. I really believe that.
Yeah, and there was something else, and I actually don't know if this is great advice, but there was something else I did, which is that I didn't try to spend like the 2 weeks leading up to the interview trying to get a mini MBA, right? Like it wasn't like I was like, I'm going to cram for this. I just was like, I'm going to be honest and humble about what I know and what I don't know. And I was very clear, like, I've been working for nonprofits since I left school. Like, I never thought I would be a consultant. Like, I didn't try to play the role because I knew they would see through that. And so I think that intellectual humility, the willingness to admit, I don't know. And sometimes in those case studies, I was like, you know what? I've never thought about this. And it wasn't demeaning or like, oh, I'm so unprepared, or, oh, I don't, like, it was just very honest and open. Yeah. And I think, again, I'm not sure if it's great advice to go into an interview and go, I don't know, but I do think it was a combination of both the engagement, the curiosity, and the sort of intellectual humility that probably really helped me there. And to be clear, there were probably still lots of people who did not want to hire me, but they did.
No, fair enough. Well, it was this experience, I guess, at this company that sort of where you started to get really interested in the dynamics of work and relationships and talking about things like conflict. So do you mind sort of fast forwarding the story and telling us sort of how you evolved to getting to the point where you start to really research that? And then ultimately, I guess, how your latest book, Getting Along, came about. So I know there's probably a lot in there, but would love to hear sort of the evolution of your career.
Yeah, I'll tell you the short version because that week, I know this is 40 minutes, so we'll keep it reasonable. At that consulting firm, like I mentioned, we worked on this report about what we called the informal organization. I was starting to do some ghostwriting actually for some of the partners. A couple of the articles I helped with got into Harvard Business Review, and someone at Harvard Business Review sort of reached out and said, do you want to do some writing for us? And so I started writing. And right away, when I started working for HBR, just on a freelance basis, they gave me a lot of freedom to pitch articles and decide what to write on. So of course, some there were assignments, but then I also kept gravitating toward articles about conflict, interpersonal dynamics, relationships, sort of the human side of business. And one of the wonderful things about working with Harvard Business Review is you have access to some of the most world-renowned experts on topics. So I could, if I was working on an article about conflict, I could call the expert on conflict who had been researching in academia for years, right? And so I don't do any primary research myself, but I really draw on the expertise of academics, researchers, from neuroscience to emotional intelligence to management science. And I started to see sort of a gap in the practical advice out there about how you deal with conflicts. And that led to my first book, which is the HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict. It's part of a series, the HBR Guide to, they have HBR Guide, I'm looking up at my bookshelf because they're all right here, but there's the HBR Guide to Negotiating, there's HBR Guide to Managing Up and Across. And so I wrote the HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict. And what I noticed when I started doing talks and workshops based on that book is that people appreciated the sort of straightforward, practical frameworks for dealing with conflict, but it was very generic. And I was getting questions in the Q&A from people who were like, this is all great, but I have this one coworker, right? And then they would describe someone who just would defy the sort of generic advice. And so again, from my work with HBR, I knew that there were people who were researching particular patterns of behavior, passive aggression, pessimism, arrogance at work. And so I thought, well, can I somehow figure out how to take that specific research and apply it to the patterns of behavior that people are most often dealing with at work? And that's where Getting Along, the recent book, came from.
Fantastic. I guess it would be a good time to talk a bit more about why are work relationships so important, but also why do they often get so difficult? And I know this from, first-hand experience and everybody listening to this world. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer the second part of the question first. So the reason they get so difficult is we're human, we're messy, right? Like, I mean, we spent a good 10 minutes at the beginning talking about early in my career, my upbringing, right? All of that influences what Esther Perel, what the psychotherapist who researches and talks about relationships, she calls it a relationship resume, right? And we all show up at work with a relationship resume. And it's not going to look the same. Ours are not going to look the same. So our expectations around how we should treat each other, what's appropriate, what's professional, it's going to all be different. The way we communicate, whether we should text each other, email each other, like all of those things we're going to show up, and it's going to be messy. And so, of course, relationships are going to be challenging. But to answer the first part of your question, they are critical. Like, as I said earlier, I can't even think of a job in which you don't have to interact with other humans. And when those relationships work, and by that, I don't mean we get along, we're best friends, although that there is research that shows we do perform better with friends. But what I mean by that is that our relationships are cordial, friendly, and we're willing to have some conflicts and disagreements and work through them, right? That's an essential part of it. And the relationships, I will say earlier in my career, especially when I worked at the nonprofit I mentioned earlier, even in the consulting firm, I sort of thought it would be nice if I liked my coworkers, but it doesn't really matter, right? Like what matters is whether I can get the work done. And what I've sort of come to realize through the years of reading people's research is actually no, like relationships are what make or break the work, right? As I mentioned, that was a big moment for me in consulting, was realizing like you can have the best strategy, most talented people, endless resources, right? Superb operational capabilities, whatever. If those people do not work well together, you will fail. And so I think I've gone from thinking relationships are the icing on the cake to thinking, no, relationships are like a core ingredient in the cake and that we need to get them right.
Okay, so important. So, what are those most kind of common factors that lead to work relationships going sour? And on the flip side of that, we'd love to see what is it that makes those relationships really work?
Yeah. There's actually, again, I'm going to answer in reverse. So some great research done by Professor, unfortunately, she's passed away, named Sigal Barsaid, about companionate love at work. And that's this idea we always hesitate. We're like, ooh, love at work, that's a little creepy. But no, what we mean by companionate love is actually cordial relationships, friendliness, being invested in one another's success, right? Caring about each other. And that doesn't mean you're having barbecues on the weekend, you're going out for drinks every night. It means that you care about each other at work. And the research shows that companionate love leads to better outcomes, better customer service, better reaching your targets, right? We're more productive. And I think oftentimes we think of relationships as getting in the way of doing the work when actually they really actually make us better. There's another piece of research that shows, done by a group of professors at Rutgers, that shows people who said they have a best friend at work tend to have higher performance ratings, right? So we actually know that people who feel connected with others at work actually perform better. There's a lot of factors. I think some are structural. So sometimes there's misaligned incentives, there's unclear objectives, right? You and I are working on a team. I think the goal is to do X, you think the goal is to do Y. No one has clarified that. That's going to lead to a lot of tension. So I think there's sort of those structural things. Sometimes the structures, like incentives, can create a lot of competition. So then we start sort of exhibiting bad behavior, playing office politics just to put one another down because we want to win in that environment. But sometimes it's also just about personalities, right? Like you may have grown up thinking it's best to be pessimistic because if you're pessimistic, you can mitigate risks, you can be safe, right? And I grew up to think, no, you should be hopeful and optimistic. And so if you and I are on a team, there's going to be a lot of tension about how we approach things, right? And your very risk averse approach is not wrong, right? But my very optimistic, let's keep pushing approach, future oriented, is not wrong either. But no doubt we will clash as a result. So a lot of it sometimes is just the way we have been raised, our personalities, And combine that with the structural power dynamics, all of that, it just does create this sort of stew of there's going to be tensions. It's just inevitable. Let's not try to fight them. Let's accept them and figure out how to work with them.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. And I think in your book, Getting Along, you share an anecdote from your own experience about reporting to someone that had this reputation for being challenging. And I have worked for somebody like that. I think I probably had an experience of two people that were very challenging as previous bosses. One that got the best out of me and the other got the worst out of me. And sort of it was hated going to work. So I would love to hear about your experience and the lessons that you learned from that, because it feels like you often do work with challenging people. So anything that we can take away from your experience would be helpful.
But can I ask you, James, what was the difference? The one where you hated going to work and the one who got the best of you? What's the difference, you think?
Both had very high expectations and were real, like, you could call them taskmasters. They were pushing me out all the time, pushing. And I guess I used to play a lot of sport and I'm a naturally kind of competitive person. And sometimes, my dad's a classic Indian dad, a sportsman, keep going, you work hard, you don't show your pain, all that sort of stuff. So I don't mind a bit of that. But I also have my mother's side, which is kind of more empathetic and caring. And I found the very aggressive style where it was almost like I had to know what they were thinking, and I would make a decision and then they would just come down so hard on me. And whereas the other one would do that at times, but there was also recognition and support, and also like this psychological safety where I could make mistakes and then they would sort of work with me on those to get better. Whereas the other one it was a blame culture and quite toxic. So I think that was it, really. They were quite, on the surface, you might say the two people were quite similar, but actually the actual inner workings of the organization made for a very different experience.
Yeah, and that makes so much sense to me because I think, and this is actually the experience you asked me about, which is in the introduction to my book, was this woman had a reputation for being difficult. I knew that going in, but I was like, oh, I've dealt with difficult people. But I think they were difficult people in the way you're describing, right? Taskmaster really, maybe a little rough around the edges, but ultimately I felt like they were invested in me. The challenge with this boss that I talked about in the introduction is that it was that she was a micromanager. There was no room for failure. Mistakes were really frowned upon and actually quite punished. And I think the other thing that was really hard is she talked about other coworkers in negative ways to me that I was like, ooh, like it just didn't feel like there was a level of support and investment in me as a person. And I had to sort of wonder, like, are you speaking badly about me to other people too? And I think it was about 3 months in, I remember turning to my husband and saying, I don't think I'm going to last. Like, I don't think I can stay here. And I ended up staying about 1.5 years, partly because I did sort of figure out how to deal with it. And I didn't change her. Let's be clear. Like, I wish I could say, oh, I did this and she was a wonderful boss. But no, it was more that I figured out my boundaries and I figured out what was I getting from that job that was useful while trying to sort of really put a wall up around the things that were really challenging. And I mean, I think ultimately when you're dealing with someone, especially a boss who you find challenging or pushes your buttons or you don't feel supported, I think that's the balance is like, is there something positive you're getting out of this? And I've had lots of people I interviewed for the book when the difficult person they were dealing with was the boss, they said, you know what I learned how I don't want to manage. And I thought, oh my God, right? Like that's not a mentor, but it's a big lesson of like, oh, I don't want to be a micromanager. I want to be very careful about how I talk about other people to my employees, right? Like all of these things. And some of them are obvious, but some of them aren't. And I think if you're in a situation where you're dealing with someone like your two bosses, I think the question is, am I actually getting something from this? And if the answer is no, I'm getting nothing, then it's time to really think about what could be your next step. And that might be leaving.
Yeah, definitely. No, thank you very much. You identified these sort of 8 archetypes of difficult people in your book. So I would love to, if you don't mind, for those that haven't read the book yet, share a bit more about these different archetypes how you identified them, because I think everybody will identify with one or maybe more. I think I'm probably the insecure boss type, the kind of imposter syndrome sets in, and I think that's probably more me. But yeah, would love to hear a bit more about them and whether there are kind of more common ones, or would love to just hear how you came up with them.
Yeah. So it's not a mutually exclusive list, meaning people can fit into more than one of the archetypes. And there are people who defy category. They don't fit into any of them, right? It's not like a Myers-Briggs where everyone will have fit somewhere, sort of a negative Myers-Briggs, but it's not like that. And really, I based those archetypes off the experience of talking to people after my talks about the first book, doing some surveys, really trying to understand what were the common patterns of behavior that people were dealing with most. The 8 archetypes are, as you mentioned, the insecure boss, so someone who maybe doesn't believe they're up to the task or worries they're not up to the task of leading or managing, and then takes that out on the people they lead by micromanaging, not trusting them, maybe hoarding information or power in a certain way. Then we have the pessimist. This is someone who's just negative all the time, maybe shuts down ideas, can't help but point out all the risks, keeps saying this is never going to work. We've then got the victim, which is sort of a type of pessimist, meaning they also think things are going to go wrong, but they only go wrong to them, right? And they really have this sort of feeling that they're persecuted, and they often use that. And you have to be careful because there are people who are truly victims at work, right? From bullying, harassment. But this is someone who actually plays that, sort of has that mindset and plays this out to their advantage. Then you've got the passive aggressive peer. This is actually the first chapter I wrote for the book. It was the one I got asked about all the time. I still get asked about passive aggressive behavior. I think it's one of the most common archetypes of the 8. And this is someone who says one thing, does another, right? For some reason, fear, insecurity, stubbornness, refuses to actually express how they think, what they think or feel in a direct way. So they find indirect ways to do it. Got the know-it-all. I think that's pretty clear. Someone who is arrogant, interrupts other people, says things with 110% certainty that they don't have any reason to be certain about. Then you've got the biased coworker. This is someone who commits microaggressions toward others. We're all biased, of course, but this is someone who sort of plays it out over and over in the organization. We have the tormentor, which I would say that second boss you mentioned might have fit into this category. Someone you actually expect to be a mentor. You expect them to look out for you, maybe because they're your boss or you share something in common and they came up ahead of you in the organization, but they do the opposite, right? They seem set on undermining you at every turn, questioning your commitment to work, assigning you needless tasks. And then lastly, you have the political operator, and that's someone who plays office politics, which everyone has to do, but plays it in a way where only they can win. And they do not care who they have to step on to get where they want to go. They often lie, steal credit. They're really unpleasant to deal with when you're on the receiving end of that. Although none of them are walks in the park, let's be clear.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like, I think everybody will go, "Oh, yes, that boss was that archetype." And we've all probably got a bit of that in ourselves, but it's a really great way of.
It's interesting that you started talking about the archetypes, about what you identify with. And I'll have to say that is not something I expected with the book, right? I expected everyone to play the game of which one is my coworker, where does my coworker fit in? But so many people tell me they're like, oh, I totally identify as the political operator, or I totally identify the know-it-all. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't expect that.
I think it's sort of a self-reflective exercise. I would say that I wouldn't necessarily tick all the boxes for the insecure boss, but definitely in the earlier days of JBM, I was a control freak because it was my name on the tin, and I was so when I started to hire people, and I wasn't very good at hiring in the early days, which is, I know, incredibly ironic given that's my day job. But for myself, I found it so much harder. But I really was, I want to see every email, and that is so far from who I actually am. That micromanaging, and I don't think I'm that anymore. But it took me a while to realize, wow, I'm not helping my team at all by being like this. And I think I've improved a lot on that, but there are still aspects of that probably still come into play. More so the questioning of my ability, I set this business up so young that I do still have that imposter syndrome in certain settings, and that can negatively impact things, I think. But I just think it's quite interesting to go, oh, where, do I fit into these? I need to watch out to not be that person. So I think that's another interesting aspect of it. But of course, those archetypes, those types of leaders will create conflict in an organization. And I want us to talk a bit about conflict management, because we all strive to build like world-class cultures. And I think you would typically think that is not about culture, that is about harmony and collaboration and all that good stuff. But I saw that you had said in one of your talks that we shouldn't strive to build this perfect team. We should actually embrace conflict, build resilience, bounce back from it, which makes a lot of sense. But I'd love you to just elaborate on that, if you don't mind, and particularly tell us, what does healthy conflict look like in a team?
The reason I think that we need to embrace conflict is because it is inevitable, right? Like, I've never worked on a team where there wasn't some conflict, right? I actually can think of one team, and where there was very, very little conflict, like almost none. And we actually were not very effective at what we were doing. It was partly there wasn't much conflict because we weren't engaged. Like, we just didn't care. So I think one is it's inevitable, right? It's not just inevitable in work environments. It's inevitable in interacting with other humans. Yes, we will hopefully get along most of the time, but there will be moments of disagreement. The second thing is, not only is it inevitable, but it's good for a team. So if you would play out that example I mentioned earlier, like if you're an extreme pessimist and I'm an extreme optimist, having us on a team is going to be challenging. Definitely. You and I are going to be frustrated with each other. And the rest of the team might be like, oh gosh, James and Amy cannot stop fighting about this, right? But having those two perspectives and having them show up and having to articulate them and work through them as a team is going to make the end product, whatever we're working on, better as a result, assuming we can keep it civil. Once you go into incivility, there's all these negative. If we're dismissive of each other, undermining, rude, there's lots of research that shows how terrible that is for individuals, for teams, organizations. But as long as we can keep it at the level of debate, of conflict, like we're having a disagreement about this, let's work it through. That is going to be good, not only for what we're doing, the goals we're trying to achieve, but also for us as individuals. We tend to learn more about ourselves. We tend to be more engaged, actually, which shows when we are able to have conflicts and then move past them. It tends to be stronger for our relationship, because then I know, you know what, James and I can get into it. We're different people, but it's okay. Like, I know we're always going to land on our feet in terms of our relationship.
And for leaders listening to this, maybe think, we don't have enough healthy conflict in our business. We need to kind of create that, but also are nervous about that kind of spiraling potentially or damaging what they perceive to be a good culture. Are there any particular tips for leaders about how to encourage it, how to bring this into an organization?
And it's interesting, as a conflict expert, I remember when I first started doing this work, I was like, I'm going to be dealing, like, I have to really hone my mediation skills. I'm going to be dealing with organizations that have a ton of conflict. I would say 95% of the organizations I work with hire me because there's not enough conflict. And they're actually looking to do exactly what you asked. So I'll share some of my biggest tips, which is, number one, talk about disagreements, normalize it. Say things like, it is inevitable that we will not see eye to eye. Let's make sure we surface those disagreements so we can work through them. Don't say that once. Say it to the point when you say it, your team rolls their eyes. They're like, yes, I get it, James. Okay, we're going to disagree. Because just like you are conflict averse, many, many people are. And so you have to really help them get over the hurdle of because it's so much easier to stay silent, to not raise the disagreement, to just be like, wouldn't it be better if things just move? But we want people to voice those ideas. We want to work through them together. So I think you really have to normalize it. When tensions come up, you have to work really hard not to shut it down, because again, that will be your instinct. And to even narrate, like, ooh, wow, this is really uncomfortable for me because I tend to be conflict averse, but this is an important conversation. Let's stick with it, right? Just so the team knows, because again, everyone's looking for the exit. As soon as the conflict comes up, like, how do we get out of this? How do we smooth it? And I see this happen all the time. Like a conflict comes up and everyone's like, well, I think it's going to be okay. Oh, no, no. Or they'll say like, oh, you guys can take that offline and discuss. It's like, no, we need to work it through and it's going to be uncomfortable.
Your commission.
Exactly. And then the last thing I would say is that I would sort of develop some skills in terms of framing. I think this is one of the things leaders really need to do is to frame. So, because what happens is if you and I are in a meeting and let's say you start being pessimistic and I'm off to it and everyone's like, oh God, right? Amy and James can never get along. And no one's sort of framing it as, you know what? James is really trying to point out the risks and Amy's really trying to be optimistic and future focused. And if you can frame it that way, and you don't have to use names, right? You can say, you know what, on the one hand, there are some serious risks and I appreciate that we're pointing them out. On the other, let's try to remain hopeful and focused on the future. What would we do if we're holding both those ideas at the same time, right? That sort of framing really helps people sort of sit with the conflict in a way that's not about James and Amy hating each other or having this personality clash or making everyone uncomfortable, but bringing it back up to the level of the idea and the debate really, I think, sort of helps the team sit with it and then ideally get through it as well.
Thank you so much, Amy. That is so valuable, and I'm definitely going to do my best to try giving all that a go, and hopefully we'll see the benefits. I'm sure we will.
Will you report back?
I will, definitely. No, it's something that I think I can start relatively quickly to sort of integrating into how I communicate with the team, and when we're having discussions, I think that's a really great way to frame it. So thank you. I guess in order to have more healthy conflict, you also need to have more resilience across the team. I think sometimes conflict can hurt and can feel exposing, and as a result, people's resilience, may get upset. And so, what are your thoughts on, or do you have any advice on how we can build greater resilience for ourselves, but also amongst our teams, so that we can do this without getting hurt, and that actually is a positive rather than a negative?
Yeah, I think two things I'll say. Number one is, when we have a conflict as a team or as two individuals, we immediately are like, ooh, I need space, right? We sort of back off. The problem is the way we sort of get back into the natural rhythm of working with one another is to actually do work together. So I think one way to build resilience is to, sort of get back on the horse, as the phrase goes, right? Is just like, this conflict happened. Okay. And it's not just about moving on. I'm not saying gloss over it, because that's going to be my second point, but getting back into the natural rhythm of working with the other person, I think, is really, really important. But you also, as a team, want to debrief. And I think very few teams, very few leaders do this, partly because they don't feel they have the skills. But if you can say, you know what, we had a lot of disagreement about how we were going to execute on that project. Things got pretty tense. What did we learn from the experience, right? What do we want to take going forward? And that's also how you build psychological safety as well, is that you don't sugarcoat the conflict, sugarcoat the failure, but you say, okay, what did we learn from this? What do we want to do differently? I can't emphasize enough. I think partly lots of people don't do this because they just don't feel like they have the time. And so things are going really fast. But I think it's actually a time saver, which is if you debrief, if you do sort of the after action review, how did that project go? What did we learn? What moments of conflict did we have? Did we work through them well? How would we do it differently next time? That actually saves you so much time in the future. And so I think that's another thing. And I really don't see a lot of organizations do this enough, or teams do this enough, which is just to reflect, right? What went well, what didn't. And it can be a very simple, this doesn't have to be a days long retreat, right? It can be a very simple, what went well, what didn't, what do we want to change next time?
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you very much. We got one more question before we get to our final wrap-up questions. And I just wanted to talk, I guess, on behalf of any business leaders out there or people that are working in more remote first companies. People can be disconnected. It's harder to build those same relationships, perhaps, when you're not face-to-face, the water cooler moments that we all are so used to having. And also, I find, and we've seen this ourselves, that conflict can arise through just lack of communication, just feeling apart, and people get isolated. So do you have any advice just in terms of how we can both build better relationships and also avoid conflict in a hybrid or remote world?
Yeah, there was research done actually pre-pandemic, and I haven't seen much since the pandemic, so I'm waiting for that research to come out. But that showed that in what was called in the academic literature, like dispersed teams or globally dispersed teams, meaning you weren't in the same location, we do tend to be very task oriented. We don't think a lot about the relationship because we just log on, let's get it done, right? There's not a lot. So I think the key for remote and hybrid work around, particularly around relationships and conflict, is intentionality. When you and I are sitting in the same room, we see each other at lunch, right? We have a quick chat before the meeting starts. We're naturally going to build that relationship. We don't actually have to put a ton of intentional effort in it. When you are remote, you have to take the time, right? And it's going to feel awkward, but it's like, let's spend every 5 minutes at every meeting, 5 minutes sharing personal details or sharing a story or telling us what's going on at the moment or whatever it is, right? That feels awkward, but it is how we actually build relationships. And so we have to be very intentional. Likewise, as you point out, conflict comes up a lot in these environments because we don't have that context. We don't have the shared context. We don't give each other the benefit of the doubt in the way, because I'm making up a story about what's happening for you. Because I don't have it. I'm constantly like, and let me be honest, they're most often when we're attributing intention to other people, we often do it negatively. So like if I showed up late to this podcast recording, right, I would have a zillion reasons why, right? Like, my dog got sick, the internet wasn't working, whatever. And it would all make sense to me. If you showed up late, I would think you were disorganized and maybe lazy, right? Like we immediately start making up these stories and they're negative. And so we have to really catch ourselves with our remote colleagues of like, I don't know why they're late or they're being rude or they sent a one-line email with no with no punctuation, right? Like I don't know why. And so rather than me assigning meaning to that, let me be curious about it. Let me be generous about it, because that's not just going to help the other person. It helps our relationship. And likewise, we have to be really intentional about when there is a conflict, actually discussing it, because it's so much easier to be like, this, I can just close my laptop. I can just close this little screen and I don't have to deal with that person again, right? But I think we have to be much more intentional about this is a conflict that will continue to fester if we don't deal with it. And so you have to take those, again, awkward, right? So awkward to resolve a conflict over Zoom, right? But we got to do it.
Do you know what? It's so recently we've been running this search for an international company, and I won't say that the country that they're based in, but they are known to be a fairly blunt nation. And so there was a small mistake that had happened, and the response on the Slack channel, we interpreted it as anger or deep frustration. And we panicked and we started thinking about, okay, how do we mitigate this? And, that wasn't, just purely crossed wires. There was not actually a big issue. And then when we got on the call for the update call, the weekly, it was absolutely fine. There was no issue whatsoever. It was just the way that it had been conveyed, like a lack of punctuation, perhaps, just small things. And do you know what? That was probably 2 or 3 days of us going, oh God, this is going to be awful. How do we... It's amazing, isn't it, how things can get lost in translation.
I think we think because we have emojis and we communicate via text all day, whether it's instant message or whatever, we think we're being so clear, right? And painting the big picture or the whole picture, not the big picture, but painting the whole picture. But you are missing so much nuance when you are reading something. You just don't know. And yet we think we know because we're like, well, that's what I would mean. Or that's, I got a Slack message like that last week and the person was really angry. So this person must be really angry. But you have to remind yourself you're making a zillion assumptions. And sometimes you just need to get on the call and say, what's going on?
Exactly.
Right? Ask a few questions. And who knows? You might be right. Maybe they were really angry and then you can deal with it. But dealing with this imagined conflict when there may not even be a conflict takes so much time and energy.
Yes, and emotional energy, exactly. Oh, well, thank you so much, Amy. This has been such a joy. We've got 2 final very quick questions. This is 40-Minute Mentor. So I have to ask, if you could be mentored by anyone, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Oh, it's funny. I knew this question was coming and I was like, I'll just decide in the moment because there's just so many people. But I have to say, and I actually think Michelle Obama, I admire her approach to what's often a difficult situation or negative energy. I just think her high road approach, I think is very tiring. And I think there's some cost to it. So I would just love to learn from her. One, how did she find that approach in her life? And two, how does she weigh the costs and benefits of that approach? Because it's something I admire, but I would love to just learn more about.
Love that answer. And we've had that. We've had Michelle Obama as a desired mentor many times before. And final question for me: what's the one piece of career advice that you would like to leave our listeners with today?
Engage in conflict. I mean, I think that it's one of those things. It's just really, we're so afraid of it, but we have to figure out, we need to develop the tools and the mindset to engage in disagreements and debates in the workplace, just for ourselves, for the team, for our careers, and for our organizations.
That's a fantastic place to end it. Amy, thank you so much for joining us on 40 Minute Mentor. I've absolutely loved that. I've got a load of ideas to take into my own business, and I'm sure our listeners will do the same. So thank you so much. I wish you the very best of luck with the book and the rest of the year.
Thank you, James.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I really hope that you found it useful and inspiring. If we have left any questions unanswered, or if you have any feedback or guest recommendations for future series, then please make sure you get in touch on info@jbmc.co.uk. I often get asked by listeners how you can help us spread the word about 40 Minute Mentor. There are two simple ways you can help. Firstly, share this episode on your preferred social media platform, and LinkedIn is probably where I'm most likely to see it. And you can also leave us a review on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Every share on social media and review left on the podcast platforms really helps us to get 40 Minute Mentor in front of new audiences and share the power of mentorship even further. Thank you so much for your ongoing support, and I look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday for even more pocket-sized mentorship.